Well, today we take a few more steps on our journey of Lent together. Now, I know that some of you perhaps were raised in Christian traditions where Lent was something that regularly came around every year. Mark Cortez was sharing with us this week that he has likely been getting ashes on his forehead on Ash Wednesday ever since he was a little baby in somebody's arms, which is a pretty cute picture if you think about it. But for many of us, Lent is sort of a new thing, and Ash Wednesday is sort of a new thing. I actually had never experienced Ash Wednesday when I was a younger person. I was raised in Methodist churches and then later on Disciples of Christ congregations, and I don't really have any memory of us doing the season of Lent. In fact, I didn't even know what Ash Wednesday was until my first year in seminary. I'm an adult, and on that Wednesday morning, several of my fellow students are showing up at the first hour class with these smudges on their forehead, and I actually thought they had maybe been reading the newspaper and gotten some ink on their hand and, had done this. They had to set me straight about that. And Debbie Sherrard was telling us the story this week of a substitute teacher she worked with once who on an Ash Wednesday saw a young student walking down the hall with his ashen cross on his forehead, and she decided to help him wipe off that arid smudge. She does this and smudges it right off his forehead. So, if Lent is something new to you, you are in good company today. But even if you were raised in a church that regularly did Lent every year, you still might be asking, but what is it again? What exactly is Lent? So just as a quick reminder, Lent is that season, that 40-day season that begins with Ash Wednesday and then goes until Easter morning. It's 40 days not counting Sundays. Sundays are considered to be sort of mini Easter celebrations to prepare us for the real celebration that will come on Easter morning. Now the 40 days is meant to represent the 40 days that the scriptures tell us Jesus spent in the wilderness being tempted and coming to a deeper understanding of God's call on his heart. It may also represent the 40 years that the Israelites spent wandering in the desert. It is meant to be a deeply contemplative and introspective season, much like Advent. It's a season when we're invited to turn inward, to look to our own hearts, and to consider more fully how we might live into the experience of God in our life. And in that sense, then, Lent is a season for all of us. It is a journey for all of us. And as part of this journey, and as we move along the way today, I want to give you a little bit of traveling music that might help you think about Lent in a different way. So, Wyatt, hit it. Some of you may recognize that is the theme song to the immensely popular podcast Serial, which is the most downloaded podcast in the entire world. Serial is sort of a spin-off of NPR's This American Life. And each season of Serial, what they do on this podcast, it's a journalistic podcast, they take one true story and they talk about it over the entire season. One story told bit by bit, piece by piece, episode by episode. And so far, their approach to this has been to take a true story and to start at the end of the story and work their way back through it. So the first season of Serial, they talked about a true life murder story, and they started at the end of the story with a man who's now in prison for the murder, and they've asked, is the right man in prison? And then they work their way back through all the details of the story. This season, they're looking at the story of Bo Bergdahl, who is the infantryman who, many of you know the story, he went AWOL in Afghanistan, and he's now about to be court-martialed. And so they start where we are at right now in that story, and then they're working their way back to that story bit by bit. So I'm going to invite us, in the form of Serial this year, to walk through the story of Ruth through the season of Lent, bit by bit, piece by piece, Sunday by Sunday, to try to discover what it might have to say for us. And just as they do in the Serial podcast, I'm going to spoil the story for you today. I'm going to tell you not only how the story of Ruth begins, but I'm going to tell you exactly how it ends. And so here's our scripture reading for today. First, from the first chapter of Ruth, and then from the fourth chapter of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons or her husband. That's how the book of Ruth begins. Now I'm going to show you how it ends. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So you see what just happened there in this story? Ruth's baby, we're told, is to be an ancestor of King David, and we know that King David will eventually become an ancestor of Jesus. And so there you see the tie to the story of our Lenten season. Now, unlike the 2 seasons of serial thus far, our story has a happy ending. It starts with death and tragedy, but by the end, just 4 short chapters later, by the end of the book of Ruth, we have birth and we have new life and we have hope for what comes next. Now, how do we get there? How do we get there in the story? How do we get from this terrible beginning to this wonderful ending in just 4 short chapters? Well, the only way to know for sure is to work through the story bit by bit, little by little together over the next few Sundays in this season. So some of you may be sitting there wondering, okay, interesting, but why the story of Ruth for the season of Lent? As we're journeying through Lent together, why would we talk about this particular story out of the Old Testament? Well, because Lent, in essence, is about journey. And the story of Ruth, at its essence, is about a journey. It is a journey story about 2 women. It is a journey story about 2 women who are committed to each other in love. In essence, it is a short story out of the Old Testament. It is what we might call historical fiction, which is to say that the story of Ruth is grounded in real historical events that happened to the Jewish people, but the story itself is fiction. And that's good news for us because it means rather than just being something that happened that somebody's reporting, it is a story crafted by a writer that is deep in plot and character and theme and symbolism, just waiting for us to come together and unearth and find meaning within. As I said, it's a story about the journey of 2 women. And given that fact right there makes it very unique in the biblical canon that 2 women are the central characters of the story. We have Naomi, the older woman, who has left Bethlehem where there's been a famine in her hometown. She's gone to Moab with her family to find food, and they've stayed there for a long time. She's had sons, but at the very beginning of the story, we find out that her husband has died, and then shortly later, both of her sons die. And she's left alone in a culture where a woman needed men to care for them. And so she is forced to make the decision to leave Moab, where she's made a home, and return back to Bethlehem, where her relatives are, to hope there might be somebody there who will care for her. It's also the story of the younger woman, Ruth, who is her daughter-in-law, who is also a widow now at the very beginning of the story. And this amazing decision that she makes, as we'll find out more about next week, this decision she makes to give up her life in her home of Moab and journey with Ruth back to Bethlehem, not knowing what might happen there. It's a story that, by all rights and fairness, probably doesn't have any place in the biblical canon because at the very beginning of the story, the very beginning, all the quote-unquote important characters are dead. I mean, they're writing this story in a patriarchal culture, a male-centric culture. So for many readers listening to it, they would have been like, what else is there to say? All the guys are dead at the beginning of the story. What's there left to say? And yet, the story is just beginning. There's a lot more to come. It is a story that's about the journey of faith and holding on to your faith even amidst the most terrible and trying and hard times of life, the painful times of life, holding on to your faith even in the midst of that. And so in that sense, I think it's probably a story that all of us will experience at some time in our life. And it is a deeply theological story, which is to say, it is a story that at its center is all about the unconditional grace and love and steadfastness of God in the lives of God's people. Which is kind of a strange thing to say because God isn't even a character in the story. God's kind of mentioned in passing in a couple of places in the story of Ruth, but never once does the narrator ever once say anything about God actually doing anything in the story. And yet I'm going to argue over the next few Sundays that God is central in the story. God is totally involved in everything that happens in the story. God is involved in the entirety of the narrative. But we might wonder, how could that be? We might say, as you read through this text, you might say, but where is God in this story? Well, to ask where is God in the story of Ruth is probably the same as asking where is God in the story of your own life. Where is God? Where is God in the world today? Given the state of things, we might very well ask that question. Given what's going on in the world today, we might say, where is God? Given the hardship and struggle that many of you are facing in your personal lives, it's a legitimate question to ask, where is God? You know, as I read the story of Ruth, I find in most cases God is at work in the background of the story. And in that way, it might be very much like your own life. I don't know about you, but I don't very often experience God as a burning bush or a voice coming out of the heavens. And yet God is there at work in my life. But I do stop to say, where is God? How is God? What is God? Why is God? Those are the questions that I'm hoping we will be willing to journey through the season of Lent together and ask about, to puzzle over together. You know, they tell us that we're living in a society here in the United States now where more and more people every day, particularly young people, are saying, I believe in God, but I have no need for a worshiping community. I believe in God, but I don't need to go to church. I believe in God, but I don't need to get together with other people who believe in God. I'll just believe what I believe. I know I have my God, and you can have your God, and those people over there, they can have their God, and that's all right. We don't really need each other. And in contrast to that, the story of Ruth is telling us something different. I think we'll discover in the story of Ruth that God is found most significantly in the midst of relationship, in community. In fact, I think we'll find as we walk through this book that we find our deepest experience of God. We learn the most about God. We find the deepest expression of God in our life when we seek God together in relationship and community. The God of the Scriptures is a God who is deeply relational. And so I want to close this morning with a story that is probably even more ancient than this ancient story that we have of Ruth in our text. It is a story about God and the very first human being that God created. This story, which is told by many cultures, explains that God and this human creature walk together each day in the garden hand in hand, in relationship, loving each other. And as they walk, quite often the human creature holding God's hand looks up into the sky, and the sky is like a giant mirror reflecting the two of them walking hand in hand. And as the human creature sees that, it is filled with love. And then one day, and nobody knows quite exactly why, that human creature gets the idea in its head that maybe I don't need God anymore. Maybe I'm the center of the universe. Maybe I'm okay all by myself. And the creature lets go of God's hand. And in that moment, that mirror of the heavens that was reflecting their image together shatters into a billion pieces, and all those little pieces of the mirror fall all over the earth. And as time moves on, different people, lots of different people, including us, they find little pieces of that mirror and they look into it and they see in there the reflection of God. But they mistakenly believe that the reflection they're seeing is the entire picture of God. What they don't realize is that all they have is one little piece of the reflection of God. And that the challenge is to find other people who have found pieces of the mirror and to put them together. That our challenge is to restore that image of God by putting all the little pieces we have found together in community, in relationship with each other, so that we have a more full and deeper and wider view of who and how and what and why God is in our lives. I'm hoping that in the season of Lent, we'll take that challenge to bring each of our little pieces of that mirror that reflects part of God's image and put them together. To take the piece of the mirror that's reflected by the writer who put together this story of Ruth and see what it has to tell us about who we are and whose we are. So that's all I have for you today. Now, I know some of you are probably wondering, but Brian, you really haven't told us anything about the book of Ruth. You barely got started. We don't know anything about the plot, the characters, what happens. All we know is how it ends. Well, that's right. You have a homework assignment this week. Your homework assignment is to go home and read the book of Ruth. It is 4 very short chapters. It moves very quickly. I want to invite you to take time to read that story and ask yourselves 2 questions. Where is God in the story? And then ask yourself, where am I in the story? To be continued. Let's pray together. Creative Spirit, in this season of journeying together through Lent, open our hearts to know you more deeply. Help us to seek you in this ancient story of our tradition, that we might more deeply understand who you are and how you are in our lives. And all God's people say, amen.